What's up, guys, and welcome back to Bass Fishing Tips. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about summertime bass fishing and the top 5 questions that anglers have about summertime bass fishing. So I recruited ChatGPT and I asked ChatGPT to scour the internet and provide for me the top 5 questions that people have about summertime bass fishing, and I'm going to read them and answer them for you guys here today. And I'm going to provide you guys with some summertime bass fishing tips that I've learned over my years of bass fishing to hopefully help you guys to go out and be more successful from the boat, bank, the kayak, or wherever you guys happen to be fishing. So without any further ado, let's go with question number 1 from the old ChatGPTs. It says, where do bass go when it gets hot? That is a loaded question, but a good question. So you really got 2 options for bass and where they go when it gets hot. Number 1, you're gonna have residential fish, and then number 2, you're gonna have those fish that are willing to move and that do move. The residential fish, for the most part, are gonna stay shallow. They're gonna look for different kinds of cover and structure to get under, to get beside, to get around. Those different kinds of cover and structure can be as simple as a boat dock or as complex as a weed bed. And oftentimes what you'll see is bass that are more residential, or bass that live shallow all year long, kind of stay within kind of a 100 square foot area their entire life. They'll spawn in that area, they'll kind of summer and winter in that area, and they just live there all year. And oftentimes those bass that live shallow have a reason to stay there, you know, whether it be a boat dock that provides shade, that provides food, that provides an area for them to spawn. It kind of has everything that they need. Or it's something like a lily pad field. Again, it provides shade, it provides food, it provides oxygen, and then maybe just 20 feet off to the right there's a sand flat that they can spawn on. There are bass that live shallow their entire life. They are born, they live, and they die up shallow. Then you have those fish that are more willing to move. And a lot of times you'll hear a lot of anglers talk about going deep in the summertime. And it's one of the best options for catching fish, because deep summertime fish are just a lot more stable. And the reason they're a lot more stable is when they get out there in that 10, 15, 20, 25, and even 30 foot of water, or even a little bit deeper, the deeper that those bass go, the more stable that water is, the cooler that water is, and the more oxygen rich that water is. Especially when you're talking about lakes like where I live, TVA river system lakes that have almost constant river flow and water flow coming through and out of the dams. That generation of water and that movement of water never lets that water stratify, and you never get what is known as a thermocline, and those bass can stay deep all year long and be provided with, again, food, somewhere to hide, oxygen, everything that they need until it's time to then go back up shallow in the spring, do the spawning type of thing. And so there's really 2 options. You can either stay shallow and find the bass that stay shallow, or you can go out deep and find the bass that go out deep. Now, within both of those statements, I want to kind of dive into that just a little bit for you guys, so that you kind of understand, what are you looking for if you decide to stay shallow? What are you looking for when you decide to go deep? So it's very dependent on every single lake. You know, I was just in Michigan last week, and some of the lakes up in Michigan, deep is considered, 200 feet of water, depending on where you're at. And then other times deep is considered 10 to 15 foot of water. And so a lot of the bass that I was catching, when you consider them like out deep, were in 10 foot of water, because just 10 foot off the bank in 10 foot of water, there was a milfoil bed that those bass could go get into. They could use that piece of cover as an ambush point, as something that allowed them to have food all around them all the time and have oxygen. Whereas if you come down to Tennessee, again, kind of referring to those TVA system lakes, a lot of times you'll hear things like ledge fishing. And what that is there are these ledges on the Tennessee River system, and it's essentially where the river kind of drops off into the river channel, and you get that deeper water. And what those bass will do is, oftentimes as that river channel comes up and kind of makes that ledge, those ledges have a gradual slope up to shallow water. That gradual slope up to shallow water allows those bass to move up in the spring to do their spawning kind of thing, and then gradually move back to those ledges right before that drop off, and they will set on those ledges. And so essentially at the bottom of that drop off is 100 foot of water. At the top, right where it starts to curve off into that river channel, can be like 10 to 15 to 20 feet of water, and those bass will hang out there because, again, current, oxygen, food, all the things that they need. Whereas if you're up shallow, oftentimes we're going to be focusing on things like aquatic vegetation, especially emergent aquatic vegetation, and then man-made structure and or things like laydowns and brush piles. You know, one of my favorite things to do during the summer is to fish docks, and it's because a dock is like one of the most perfect environments for a bass to live in outside of that deep water, because again, it creates not only a piece of cover that the bass can get up underneath and feel safe, a piece of structure that they can sit next to, it also attracts the things that bass want, which is food, and then being in that shade, in constant shade that never changes. I think that that's the most important part. You know, like trees can fall, leaves fall off trees, and trees grow new leaves, brush piles can move, but for the most part, docks stay the same all the time, and that constant oftentimes in a bass's life will keep them in that area. And so boat docks is one of my favorite things, but you also can't discount everything else that I talked about as well. Another one of my favorite things to do is things like aquatic vegetation, especially emergent aquatic vegetation, things like lily pads, milfoil, hydrilla, you know, all the different variations that we have there. And that's simply because it is an area that bass will relate to. They don't have to have it to survive, but it's something that attracts food, it creates oxygen, it creates cover, it creates structure. You're starting to hear kind of a pattern here of what we're looking for, and all of those things are going to attract bass, keep bass shallow. One of my favorite examples of this is there's a lily pad field that I found a couple years ago, and it's the only lily pad field that I have found on this entire lake, and that lily pad field always is holding bass. Multiple bass, often big bass, often a school of bass, and it's just because that little lily pad field is almost an oasis in the kind of barren wasteland that the rest of this lake is, and those bass are attracted to that because everything else that a bass loves to eat is attracted to that. That creates shade, it creates structure, it creates oxygen, and it just has everything that those bass need. And so that's kind of the two places where bass go in the summer. Now there are some, you know, kind of weird niche examples all throughout the country where bass do a little bit different things, but if we're really talking about like what covers the most, what's the big blanket statement that was going to help the most of you guys, there's fish that stay shallow, that are residential, and there's fish that go deep, and those are kind of the things that they sit on. All right, question number 2. What are the best baits for summer bass fishing? Golly, again, super loaded question, but we'll try to dive into it just a little bit. I think that like when we talk about deep water fishing, deep diving crankbaits, big worms, like really big worms, like your 6, 7, 8, 10, 12 inch, just magnum size worms. Things like football jigs, big swim baits on jig heads, you know, like 4 to 6 inch swim bait on a jig head, stuff like hair jigs. And when I say hair jigs, I don't mean like marabou hair jigs. I'm talking about them big bad, you know, hair jigs that you rip off the bottom, stuff like spoons, and maybe like some sort of big creature bait, you know, whether it be like a big crawl or something like that. A lot of the times when you're dealing with those offshore fish, you're going to be dealing with schooling fish. And oftentimes if you can get a school fired up on a certain bait, it could be a worm, it could be a crankbait, it could be a spoon. I mean, you just gotta have to go out there and experiment. You can catch multiple fish in a row off of any given school, and you can run school to school to school and you can catch fish, and it's so much fun to do. But oftentimes in that deeper water, you gotta have baits that can get to those fish in that deeper water, and so you gotta have those big like 20-foot diving crankbaits. You gotta be fishing those 1/2 ounce to 3/4 ounce and even 1 ounce jig heads and weights and things on stuff like your jigs and, you know, your big spoons and your big swim baits and stuff like that. And so just bigger presentations that do a really good job of looking like big threadfin, big gizzard shad, things that are going to attract those bigger bass that live offshore to eat. Now, when we're talking about shallow water bass, this is where I actually kind of start to lean more on the finesse side of things. You know, I start to downsize. I start throwing things like smaller creature baits, weightless wacky rigs, weightless flukes, you know, those more subtle presentations, because oftentimes those bass that stay shallow, kind of what I referred to in question number 1, they're going to be a little less stable. You know, there's not as much dissolved oxygen in the water up shallow. Often the water's going to be a little bit warmer. There's probably going to just be generally more pressure on those fish, not only from other anglers, but just residential boat traffic and things like that. And so those little bit more subtle presentations can often help us to get bites, because we have to do more of tricking those bass into getting to eat versus getting those bass to react to something and getting a school fired up. And so when I think about shallow water fishing, especially like ponds, creeks, rivers, those types of things, going a little bit more subtle, a little bit more small in the summer often helps us to combat fishing pressure, as well as just, you know, weather pressure and the fact that everything's starting to get warmer, everything's starting to get hotter, and we kind of got to combat both of those things. And so those are kind of like generally some of the best things to throw in the summertime. I've done a ton of videos. We do our monthly breakdowns on here. I do individual videos throughout the month on individual techniques for any given time of the year. And so as we start to move further into the summer, just go back and I'll make sure and link some stuff down below so you guys can go check it out. Check out other stuff that we've done in the past to kind of help you know specifics on where and what to fish at any given moment, because that is a very deep, complex question, because again, it's one of those things, depending on where you're at in the country and the type of lake that you fish is really going to be dependent on, you know, what you're actually going to be throwing. All right, question number 3: when should you fish in the summer? All right, that's a really good question as well. I will say that generally, what I've found, both deep and shallow, that getting up and getting out there early in the morning and or late in the evening and even throughout the night doing night fishing is the best time to actually go out there and try to catch bass. And I think a lot of that has to do with just the fact that bass, number one, are more active in low light environments. And so as the days get longer as we go into the summer, there is just more light that's going to be penetrating the water throughout the day. And as more light penetrates the water throughout the day, the bass, being a creature that is very, very affected by light, this is talked about in Knowing Bass, they really kind of, a lot of what their life and how they operate depends on how much sunlight they're exposed to. And so the more sunlight they're exposed to, the more apt that they are to kind of narrow their feeding windows. And so what I kind of like to think about is, as days get longer, feeding windows get shorter. As days get shorter, feeding windows get longer. Talked about this in other videos. And so, you know, you're really going to have like a window in the morning from daylight until, you know, that 10, 11, when really the sun kind of peaks in the sky, gets the pinnacle of the sky, gets right up over your head. And then you're going to have that window when the sun starts to wane as we start to go into the evening. And then obviously all throughout the night and any time that it's dark, those bass are going to want to eat more. And what's really crazy is a lot of people think, you know, shallow water night fishing is just a shallow water affair. Night fishing is just a shallow water affair, and it's not. You know, I've done so many, there's been so many times that I've gone fishing at night and like caught them on a deep diving crankbait off of a point. Those fish just get a lot more active at night because they start to spread out a little bit more. They kind of get a little bit more willing to move around. They're not as isolated to whatever they may be sitting offshore, and you can get some really big bites and get fish that may not have ate during the day to actually eat at night, and vice versa. Because again, kind of what I talked about, you know, oftentimes a bass's eyes work better in lower light. And so at night, a bass just feels like has an advantage, or its instincts tell it that it has an advantage over the bait fish that it's trying to consume. And so anytime the light is low, early in the morning, late in the evening, and throughout the night is going to be the best time to get those bass to eat, especially in the summer. Because again, rule of thumb, the longer the days get, the shorter the feeding windows get, and then the shorter the days get, the longer the feeding windows get. They kind of are inverse, and it's kind of yin and yang. As one goes, the other one comes. As the other one goes, the other one comes. All right, question number 4. Does water temperature matter? Absolutely, 100%, without a shadow of a doubt. This is just generally in bass fishing, I believe that water temperature is one of, if not the most important thing that you are going to look for and look at as a bass angler. Even if you don't have electronics, simply go get a thermometer that you can toss over to the side of your kayak or toss in the water from the bank so that you can get a good idea of where the water temperature is at. Water temperature affects so much of what a bass does. And, you know, we talk about how bass are very affected by light as well, and it's because light often dictates what the water temperature is doing as well. The longer the days get, the more sunlight exposure is, obviously the warmer the water is going to get, and vice versa. And so, you know, with a bass being an animal that's dictated so much by water temperature, I think water temperature in summertime bass fishing is super important because it's going to help us to dictate the choices that we make on lures, locations, techniques, all of those different things. I mean, obviously, if you're a shallow water guy or you only have access to the bank or a pond or something like that, as that water warms up and it gets into that 80, 85 and even 90 degree range. I've seen surface temperatures here as warm as 90 degrees. When you're shallow water fishing, that's when those fish are going to be the most sluggish. They're going to be the most lockjaw, when they're not going to want to participate the most, and that's when you're going to have to get as sneaky and finessey as you do all year. Versus when you have those fish that are out deep, like I said, they're a lot more stable. And so oftentimes you'll have surface temperatures in the 70s and the 80s, but when you go 25 foot down, that water could still be 65, 70 degrees. And so those fish are going to be a lot more apt to eat things like deep diving crankbaits, big spoons, hair jigs, and all the things that we just discussed a few minutes ago. And then two, on kind of the inverse of that, it also helps me to dictate where I'm going. Oftentimes this time of year, I say oftentimes, almost exclusively this time of year, I'm spending a lot of time in the plastic boat, or I'm taking the boat that I'm sitting in right now and I'm running as far up into a river or a creek, a feeder creek, a groundwater creek, whatever it is. I'm going and looking for cooler water, because oftentimes when you find that water that's actually feeding that lake, whether it be a river, a stream, groundwater, even in your pond, it could be a river, a creek, or something like that. There's something that's feeding that body of water. That water can be 10 and even 20 degrees colder than the rest of the lake and the rest of the body of the water that I'm fishing. And those fish in that area are just generally going to be more active, because the cooler the water is, the more dissolved oxygen there is, and the more dissolved oxygen there is, the more willing those bass are to eat things, because their metabolism kind of peaks in that 65 to 75 degree range when it comes to water temperature. And so water temperature is so important, because it helps us as anglers dictate what we're going to do, where we're going to do it, and how we're going to do it to actually go and catch bass. So I would implore anybody, if you can't get your hands on electronics, simply just go and get a thermometer from the Walmart that you can toss in the water and figure out what the water temperature is, because knowing water temperature is going to help you to dictate what you're going to do and how you're going to actually catch bass. And then go looking for new places to fish. You know, get on Omnia, the Pro app over on Omnia, or any of these other apps. You know, you can just go online and look up, I think it's, what is it? HGS or whatever, it's the ground surveys, and essentially they will tell you water flows, where the water's coming from, what the CFS is, and all those different things. You can find creeks, streams, and rivers that will hold giant bass, because that water is more stable throughout the year. It's moving, it's oxygenated, and bass in those environments are just more apt to eat than fish that are in 85 degree water up under a dock. And so yes, water temperature absolutely 100% matters, and I think it's one of the most important things for a bass angler to understand. All right, question number 5, should I fish structure or cover? It's a good question. We've kind of discussed this a little bit already, and I'm guessing you guys kind of know what I'm going to say. Both are very important. Cover and structure are two words that I think get used interchangeably, but they mean two different things. So structure is going to be things that are permanent. They don't move. Things like rock piles, ledges, bluff walls, those types of things. There's structure. You know, there's actually structure to it. They stay there. They don't move. They're never going to go away. Whereas cover is something that can go away. It's kind of how I tend to think about it. It's stuff like brush piles, it's stuff like overhanging limbs, it's stuff like docks that cover a bass. Again, cover and structure, lily pads, or any other aquatic vegetation. Those are all things that come and go. They can be shifted, they can be moved, they can be there one year and gone the next. And so you want to fish both of those things, because as we've discussed in this video, both of those things are going to hold fish depending on where you decide to fish, whether it's deep, whether it's shallow, whether you're in a northern lake or a southern lake, if you live in Florida, if you live in Texas. All of those different factors play into the decision-making process if we're going to fish cover or structure. And sometimes structure holds cover, and sometimes cover's next to structure. And so all of those things kind of get mixed into this big pot that is bass fishing. And a lot of the times that truly, when we boil down to what is bass fishing, it's that decision-making process. It's all these decision-making processes that we've just talked about. And I mean, as you guys can see, just as me talking about this, there is a Rolodex of different ideas and thoughts that roll through my brain as I make these videos. And I think one of the most important things, just a little bonus tip here, right here at the end, and if you've stayed this far into the video, congratulations, you get this little tip, but that's be an active angler. As you catch fish, and as you catch more fish, the excitement of catching the fish will sort of wear off. And what I mean by that is I want to say this and preface this by saying I'm excited by every fish that I catch, and I love every fish that I catch. But the more fish that I've caught over my life, what I'm able to do is in the moment of actually hooking the fish, catching the fish, reeling the fish in, that process is more of a instinct to me. It's more of just a skill that I have versus a process that I have to go through. And because of that, I start to notice things. When that bass bites, I look and I say, what did that bass bite on? Was he on the corner of a dock? Was he on a brush pile? Where was I lined up when I made that cast? Those little subtleties, being an active angler and noticing those little subtleties will help you to build your Rolodex and build your dictionary of ideas, processes, thoughts. And then from there you start to pick the right baits, pick the right areas, pick the right scenarios, and then you start just catching more and bigger fish. And so be a very active angler, and I think that plays right into that question is, which one do we pick? Knowing and understanding both, understanding where bass have been in the past, where bass are biting now, and where bass should be going, all play into being an active angler and understanding how to pick, and then really going through all 5 of those questions and being able to fish summer bass fishing effectively. So yeah, guys, that's the top 5 questions that ChatGPT said the internet had about bass fishing. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure and click this video. It's popping up right here.